Hello there. Welcome back to the podcast where today I'm delighted to be joined by a very old friend of mine, Gail Thibert. I've said that right. Have it?
Yeah, 10 out of 10. Fantastic.
Excellent.
Well done.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah, pronunciations are sort of quite a regular feature of this that I have to try and work out I'm pronouncing something right.
yeah, it's a
Weirdly.
funny
There we go.
surname. It's a bit hyacinth bouquet. It doesn't quite, that's what people say, because when it's written down, it's like Thibert or Thibert. And
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, the correct pronunciation is to pretend you're French. And I just say T-bear.
yeah. Cool.
T-bear. Yeah,
Okay. So, yes, you are a professional psychic and a sort of long-time member of the punk rock club, essentially.
yeah.
And that the punk rock club aspect of it is how we know each other, but the psychic bit is, I suspect, where we're going to go. But I'll start these things where I always do by asking you a little bit about your upbringing and specifically how it kind of, you know, whatever it was in your upbringing that you reckon kind of
Mm.
pointed you in the direction you went in, really.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd quite an unusual upbringing, I suppose. Well, I suppose it depends on who you talk to. So I was born in central London. I was born in Westminster Hospital. So when people say you're from north or south, I'm from central London. Actually, there is no central London postcode because it all starts WC, W1.
Yes. Yeah.
So technically kind of southwest London. So we lived in Pimlico and my parents are both from Brixton, but my grandparents were an eclectic mix. My granddad was French and hence the unpronounceable surname, and my grandmother on my dad's side was Norwegian. So I've got this very unusual. I'm very tall. I'm very tall and I like garlic. What can I say? So there's that side. And then on my mum's side, very British, Irish and Yorkshire mix on my mum's side. And we grew up, yeah, Pimlico. And then we emigrated to Canada for a year. I lived in Toronto for a year, which I don't really remember because I was really tiny. And I came back with this lovely scar on my forehead because my dad was driving us. And in those days, we didn't have to wear seatbelts. And I'm probably living proof of why you should wear seatbelts because he braked really suddenly and I decided to headbutt the dashboard. So I grew up thinking I was a dolphin, with the dolphins blowhole. Just kind of strange thing. And then it didn't work out in Canada for my dad. He couldn't get a job. And apparently there's lots of Thiberts in Canada. It's a French-Canadian name because a lot of the French colonies, in Quebec and places like that, it's quite a common name out there. And so we came back and ended up living in Brixton with my mum's parents, which didn't go too well. And I don't want to go into details, but we ended up moving out of there. And our first house was in Raynes Park, southwest London. So I grew up in Raynes Park, went to school in Raynes Park and Wimbledon, and then we moved to Morden. So most of my early childhood was around Morden, Wimbledon, Raynes Park. So I know those areas very well. And then I escaped. I discovered punk rock, as you know, around about the age of 13, 14, and started to go to gigs, which was a real liberation, as I'm sure it was for you and for lots of people. It's just this real sense of freedom and the family that I always wanted, I suppose, the people that were more on my wavelength than my birth family. And so, yeah, the psychic side, my grandparents had kind of on both sides had always been into what we called parlor games. So in those days, for entertainment, people would have a few drinks and break out the Ouija board. So that was one of the things my dad grew up with. He did the Ouija. I'm not a fan of Ouija myself. I've never actually used a proper Ouija board. I've done human Ouija in part of my mediumship training, which is very interesting. It's not for the faint-hearted. It's not something you should go into lightly. It certainly is something you shouldn't be doing when you've been drinking. Because, let's have a party and throw the door open and let everyone come in. We've all done that and dealt with the consequences. And psychic work is a bit like that, really. which is why we have gatekeepers and guardians and spirit guides. In the same way, if you're having a posh party, you'll have somebody monitoring the door, what, you know, checking, you know, who comes in. So yeah, the family had been quite psychic. My dad's, as I said, did Ouija. He was very interested in the spirit world. He was a big fan of Doris Stokes, who around about the 70s, she was a really well-known medium. You know, she was as famous as like Colin Fry is now. And so he had this interest, but he never developed it, my dad. He never went to spiritualist church. He was a big believer in healing. And my family, my dad was one of 5. So, you know, my Norwegian French grandparents had 5 children. My dad was the eldest. And he had this kind of, I grew up with the spiritual side, the psychic side being very normal, you know, and then as I got older, I realized that wasn't the case in other families. You know, what I thought was completely normal. I remembered past lives from when I was 4 years old. You know, I can very vividly, and if I say them now, it might sound really ridiculous and far-fetched. So we'll wait until I publish a book, and then because it'll be in writing, you'll have to believe it. So there's that, you know. But yeah, so I had these really vivid memories, and it was kind of just taken for granted that I was psychic. I mean, on my dad's side, my aunt, my youngest aunt, the youngest one of my dad's 4 siblings, she dabbled in tea leaf reading and playing cards, but nobody ever read tarot. I was the first. In fact, I'm the only one in my family that reads tarot, or does any kind of professional fortune telling. On my mum's side, there was, you know, playing card readings. I think it was quite fashionable back in those days to do that. And so yeah, I had this kind of grew up with, it was never a weird thing. And we grew up in our house. So in Raynes Park, which was my earliest memory, there was always a sense of somebody else being there. There was always a sense of we were not alone, you know. And there used to be floorboards that creaked on their own, like nobody had walked round, and the floorboards would creak. And my dad, I can remember as like a 5-year-old, my dad taking up every floorboard in the house to try and work out which one it was that was creaking, and he couldn't pinpoint it. And around the age of 4, I developed tuberculosis. Now, my mum had been a TB nurse in the past, which was a stroke of pure luck, because she spotted it in its early stages. Now, it's funny, I live in a tunnel link house now, and in Raynes Park, I lived in a tunnel link house. So they used to do. So a tunnel link house is basically it's a terraced house, but there's a tunnel between the 2 walls.
Oh yeah, I know.
Yeah. And so they would have delivered the coal through there. And we used to have a coal fire, and we had the coal bunker. I don't know if you grew up with all of that. And the coal man would come through the passage and deliver your coal. And the bin was put out. So I think the bins had been gone out and come back in, and nobody had put it away. And I came, as kids do, running through the passage, mum, smack bang into the bin. And so then I'm burst into tears, as you would, because it, you know, hurts. And then my mum's checking me for lumps and bumps. And then she came across all these bumps under my chin that shouldn't have been there. And she, being a TB nurse, you know, she had red flags with it. And the next thing I know, I was whipped down to the hospital having an exploratory. So I've got this scar under my chin.
Oh yeah.
When I was 4 years old, that's an exploratory. So some people sort of assume I've been knifed or something. I'm actually not that hard, so no. So it was some TB. But then I found myself on medication for many years and lots of chest x-rays. So I was in and out of hospital quite a lot. And the medication they put me on made me hallucinate. Now, I don't know if that's what opens my sixth sense, if it enhanced my psychic ability, a bit like being on acid. You know, I would see stuff. Right. So the wallpaper moved. And years later, when I got into punk, and well, not even into punk, when I started partying, and people spoke to me about acid, I thought, oh my God, I've been there. I don't want to go there. I've done that when I was 5 years old. You know, and I didn't want any experience that I couldn't be in control of, because enough was going on in my day-to-day life as it was. So the wallpaper would move. I'd wake up, I'd really vivid nightmares, real hallucinations. And I couldn't really distinguish between what was real and what wasn't. Now, on top of that, we had this entity around the house. We didn't know who it was, but my dad picked up on it as well. So there was something there. And I used to wake up, and maybe some other people might relate to this, otherwise you might have me carted off to the funny farm, I don't know. But you know, hey, I'll make friends. But I, you know, I used to wake up in the middle of the night. Not only was I hallucinating and seeing stuff, there was actually 3 shadows by my bed, and then 3 human shadows.
Silhouettes.
And yes, yeah. So I didn't know who or what they were. They wouldn't do anything. I was terrified. And around that time, I mean, I was 4 or 5 years old. I just started Catholic school, and I thought my dad was Catholic, but it turns out he wasn't. He just wanted his daughters, I've got a sister, he wanted his daughters to go to a good school. Fair play to him. They got a good education. But the penalty was that we had to learn Catholicism. So, you know, at an early age, you don't question anything. We were told about Jesus, Mary and Joseph and Christ and God and all this stuff. And I believed it all. You know, I really kind of took it all in. I thought, wow, this is amazing. There's this, you know, entity that's looking after us and loving us, you know, because I ain't getting much love at home. So that's good. You know, that's a good thing. And so these 3 shadows, my rational self was saying, well, maybe it's my mum, dad, and my sister, because it was in that kind of height order. And as I say, they didn't come every night, but they came in and they were right next to the bed. So I used to turn my back and face the wall, because I thought to myself, well, if they're going to kill me, I don't want to see them do it. They can stab me in the back. So that's the kind of crazy things that was going in my head at that age. And then I thought, well, what would my mum, dad and sister be doing there? You know, rational thinking, why would they be standing there watching me sleeping? It just didn't make sense. And then because I'd been brought up to believe in, you know, the Catholic faith, I then rationalized it was Jesus, Mary and Joseph. Of course. Why wouldn't it be? That's what I've been force fed at school. So I was like, oh, okay, that's fine. They're just looking after me. They're my guardians. Years later, and it wasn't until I was in my kind of 40s and 50s, I heard about shadow people and I heard about greys. And apparently they're not good things. They're not good things to be watching over you. So they're kind of observers. So I had all that. So this darker stuff coming in. So it wasn't nice. And interestingly, I was never particularly interested in mediumship because I was scared, you know, because I'd already had all this weird stuff going on at a really early age. Anyway, we moved house. We moved from Raynes Park, this tiny little house we lived in, really. It was so small that when my sister moved into her room, the box room, my dad had to saw about 2 feet off the bed to get it in there. I remember him sawing through the mattress to get her bed in there. And we didn't have central heating. I mean, by heck, it would tough. So my dad worked for what was then known as the GPO. He later become British Telecom. And when we were cold, he would just put this really heavy coat on, you know, the old, almost like the donkey jacket, you know, like they had these long coats. So we moved to Morden, but we still had something around us. Now, if you bear in mind, my dad had been dabbling about with Ouija boards without my knowing. You know, I didn't know about them at that time. So he was bringing all sorts in. And, you know, my dad was a drinker. You know, he wasn't, you know, I struggle to say that my parents were alcoholics, but rationally they actually were. They were kind of alcohol dependent, but they were social drinkers. So, you know, when you just can't, it's hard to stick a label on it. So
everyone drank more back then, though, didn't they?
Absolutely, and did the homebrew. You know, he did all the homebrew. My dad, I remember him doing all that.
Yeah.
And but I can remember the doors opening on their own at home, and it was just normalised. So we'd be sat in the living room, I'd be sat with my mum, and the door would open on its own, and my mum would just go, entree, because she thought she was French by marrying, you know, somebody who was
Brilliant.
from French descent, you know. And it was as if somebody came in, looked around the room, and then went out again. We could actually feel the energy of as if somebody had come in and gone out. And then the door would just slam shut. It was almost like they couldn't find what they were looking for. And we just go, oh, goodbye. And that was a common occurrence. And I guess that doesn't happen in everyone's house. You know, did that happen in yours? Did you grow up with this?
No, I would say that was not an everyday occurrence.
No. And I thought it was. I just thought, oh, well, this is, you know, this happens to everybody. And we had stuff like the TV. We had, do you remember the old TVs in the cabinets when TVs were absolutely massive? We had that. And it was always on the blink, you know, because we weren't a wealthy family. We got by with basically the first people in our family on my dad's side not to live in a council house, you know. So we just kind of come out of, you know, this kind of, with both my parents worked, and so, you know, they could just about afford a mortgage, and copious amounts of alcohol and fags. But you know, I'm going to lose my train of thought now. So I was saying about the weird occurrences, and the telly. That was it. The telly would always go on the blink, and you used to get the fuzzy white lines. And it was my job. I had to go and put my hands on the telly and heal the telly. That was, you know, nobody else could do it. Nobody else in the family. So they knew I had these healing hands. So they'd be like, can you just put your hands on the telly, Gail? And it worked. That was the thing. It actually worked. And if somebody lost something, like, where's my keys? Gail, where's the keys? They're under your bed, of course. You know, because to me, it was just, it's known as a sense of knowing when you just automatically know things. So that's quite a bizarre thing, but it can get you into trouble, you know, because people just think you're being arrogant and being cocky. And I found at school, you know, it was great. Multiple choice was great because it's like I just felt what felt like the right answer, and I still do. I watch quiz shows now to see how far I can get, and I'm like, I've no idea what that answer. I've never heard of these people. By that reckoning, I should be a multimillionaire and, you know, go on Britain's, you know, what's it, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? But unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, because we as psychics are still human. We still have our lessons to learn, and we get kind of, you know, when we get too big for our boots, we kind of get slapped down, so to speak. You know, we kind of get, some psychics will say, well, we get our power taken away from us. You know, we get disempowered to prove that it's not all us, that we're working with a higher energy or whatever. So
there's a lot there to be going on with. I was saying on a similar interview the other day, actually, that I have no idea really the kind of makeup of people who watch this, but I suspect there will be certainly a percentage of those people who will sort of not believe a lot of what you just said. How do you think? How do you think we've got this kind of duality come about, where there's people like you, and then there's people who actually think you're either mad or making it up? I presume they're the opposite.
I think you've got people who, one of the things I do is palmistry, and I started doing palmistry at 12 years old. And I always had an interest in, like, Arthur C. Clarke and the mysterious world, the unexplained. You know, there used to be a TV program, wasn't it? Arthur C. Clarke and the world of the unexplained. I loved it. And when you look at palms, you'll notice that people are more, some people are more linear, they're more intellectual. They don't use their intuition at all. And I think we call those people accountants. We call them, because sometimes I do corporate work and I go out. I did something recently. It was for Data IQ Awards, it was called. And there was like 400 people there. And I went around doing palmistry. And everyone mostly had this same line on their hand, this linear thinking. And I was like, yeah, you don't believe in all this. And they were like, but they're saying, yeah, but everything you're telling us is absolutely true. I said, yeah, but your logic is telling you that I must have had a script, and they agreed. So I think there's a lot of people who are just very in their headspace, very linear, it's like, prove it. I don't believe it till I prove it. And then you've got other people who are much more into their intuitive sides. A lot of people have had to survive on their wits, for example. And I've thought about this as to why was I the more psychic one in the family? My sister is psychic, but she has it more in dreams. My sister's very analytical. She's got PhDs, MAs, you name it. She's got letters coming out of her ears, very highly intellectualized lady. I'm dyslexic. I can't absorb written information easily at all. I learn by hearing things, by talking to people and tuning in. So I think some people have to naturally tune in. And I think if you've come from a mindset, if your experience is you've always been linear, you've always been thinking, and you've always had to kind of work on hard facts and prove it, then the world that I live in is completely alien. That's an alien concept. And I think scientists particularly constantly try to debunk psychics. We get invited a lot to take part in tests. And do you remember James Randi? Is it James Randi, the famous debunker, the psychic? He made a living out of debunking psychics.
No, I'm aware there's those people about, and there's a skeptic.
He was on telly. He was really well known for disproving things.
Yeah.
And I personally, I couldn't stand the guy, but he's a lot of he had a lot of respect in his field. He was a very, so people said, a very intelligent guy. And I never met him. I never wanted to meet him.
Yeah.
But if people say, if people want to poo-poo it, it's fair play to them. People poo-poo religion, people poo-poo all sorts of things, and that's their prerogative. And I never set out to convert people or to try and change their mind or to prove it. And on that respect, my favorite term at the moment is that I'm not a dancing monkey. I'm not a performing monkey. And the energies I work with, the spirit world, are not performing monkeys. They're not here to prove it to you. And on the level of mediumship, I had a client, even just might have even been Monday, very recently had a client came and, I've paid my money, right, here we go. And she sat herself down, she said, right, I want the mediumship, please. It was like she was ordering off the menu.
Yeah, and for dessert.
Mediumship. I booked half an hour. I want you to connect. I said, who do you want me to connect with? Because well, there's nobody here, Oh, you tell me. And she was like there with her arms folded, like, you prove it. As soon as you've got someone with their arms folded, you're like, oh, right, you've just closed yourself off, really, in body language. And I had to really explain to her the process, that I said it's not like, well, sometimes it is like picking up a phone and dialing a number. But Gerard, sometimes I ring you and you're not available. So why would the spirit world be automatically available when we ring them? And you might be doing something else, or you might not want to talk to me, or you might just not heard the phone. So if we can have that in real life, we can have that in the spirit world, that we can't connect with them for whatever reason. Phone's broke. I misdialed. Look, James Randi instead. Sorry,
Yeah,
doesn't believe in all this.
I introduced you as a psychic, but we're sort of already talking about different things, really, aren't we? Mediumship. Yeah. As we're talking about mediumship, and as I've been wondering how to phrase what I'm about to say, it occurs to me that psychic is kind of one of those words that's sort of a bit like alcoholic or terrorist, in the sense that it can mean whatever you want it to mean, depending on
umbrella term.
Yeah,
an umbrella term, a bit like Christianity, because you might be a Christian, but you might be a Methodist, you might be a Baptist, you might be a Catholic, you might be Church of England. You might be a spiritualist medium, which also is Christian. Yeah.
Mediumship is something I didn't actually expect us to talk about at all, actually.
So
But
we
it's
don't have
quite.
to.
Oh, no. I'm quite happy to let the conversation go
Yeah.
where it's being led, really, by.
But people assume it's a funny thing, Gerald, because the minute you say you're psychic or you get introduced as being psychic, people don't really always know what that means. So the most common thing I've experienced, bearing in mind I've been a professional psychic, meaning that I've done it for money since I was 19. So that's 40 years, almost 40 years of my life. That's me giving my age away now. But I've read palms since I was 12. And the most common thing is like, oh, this is Gail, she's psychic. Somebody will shove their palm in my face. So they assume that I'm going to read their palm because I'm psychic.
Oh,
And although I do read palms, my favorite tool is tarot. I absolutely love the tarot. I think it's an amazing tool. It's full of wisdom and anybody can learn it. And so people assume that, or they'll say, I'll be on a booking, because as I say, I do a lot of party work, and I'll be hired to read somebody's tarot in a party with the disco going on in the background. And in fact, recently, as you know, I was put on the dance floor at a party and I looked up and there was a pole dancer dancing away while I'm trying to read people's palms and cards. It was hilarious. And then I'll get someone going, can you connect? And actually at this booking with the pole dancer, can you connect with my dad or whoever, somebody passed. And I'm like, well, I'm actually just reading cards and palms, but I'll have a go. And sometimes it works. That's the crazy thing. And you would think with all this chaos going on, that you've got to have a quiet environment, a bit like meditation. What is it they say? If you can meditate in the middle of Piccadilly Circus with all the cars going and all the traffic, then you're doing it right.
Absolutely, yeah. Very much I would say that about meditation, and that's what it's for. It's not for sitting at the top of a mountain with baggy trousers on. It's for a cold, wet night on Lewisham High Street. Yeah, absolutely. So mediumship kind of throws up various questions that are really challenging and that are really quite Marmite as well. For instance, like I'm guessing, but correct me if I'm wrong, that mediumship is based on the presumption or the assertion of an afterlife, for instance.
Yeah. So if you look into, say, for example, the Spiritualist Association of Great Britain, which exists, there's a College of Psychic Studies, there's the Arthur Findlay College up in Stansted, not far from me, which trains mediums. And their kind of catchline, I suppose, is that mediumship is the evidence of survival of life after death. And that's all it is. That's all it's there to provide. And, if you're interested in the subject, read as many books as you can on it, because you're not going to have one person tell you, you've got to experience things for yourself, first of all. And I think people often go for a mediumship reading expecting too much. And I get it with my clients, and I have to explain to them that one of the things I really respect, not a lot of people respect her, is a lady called Sally Morgan, because people have tried to debunk her. But one of the things she has done is kind of hammered home that it's an amazing gift. It's an amazing thing to do. And I think the TV psychics are under incredible pressure to be those performing monkeys, which I've now decided I don't want to do. I don't want to be a performing monkey. But if you get something which is bang on. So the first time I received mediumship, I was actually working in a psychic fair doing my tarot. And I turned my back on mediumship because I was terrified. I didn't want to be possessed. I didn't want a spirit to come in and not leave, like the unwanted party guest, can you go now, please? So I was terrified of it. And then I'd lost my mum. My mum had been gone, I don't know how many years. My mum died at 60. She died very young. And this lady came up to me. She was the medium of the fair. Everyone else was just psychics, And she said, I got your mum here. And I thought, oh yeah, of course you have, you know. And she just went, Anne. And I was like, oh my God, you got my attention now. My mum was Anne. And then the stuff she came out with, I just thought there is no way she could have made it up. I don't talk about my family very openly and freely. And I was just absolutely blown away. But you might get some kind of evidence that somebody's around. And a lot of people will say, oh, I saw a white feather. That's my guardian angel, or that's so-and-so looking after me. And some people might say, oh, I saw a robin. When my mum first passed, I kept seeing a little robin outside my kitchen window, and I just felt comfort in that, because there's a belief that they're messengers from the other world. When my friend Steve died, BBP Steve, we were great mates. We really got on well. And I looked up, I'd just been doing a reading for somebody. I looked out my window and there was a can of Stella Artois by my car wheel. And I thought, well, that's no coincidence, because that's what he drank. And immediately I saw it sprang to mind. And I'd been out a few times and I'd seen these random cans of Stella Artois along my journey. And the other thing he shows me is safety pins, because he's an old punk rocker. And I'll just find random safety pins around the way, around the house or whatever. And you might kind of rationalize it and say, oh, you know, that's ridiculous. It's just coincidence. You might just say, oh, and to a degree, you could argue that. But when it's happening in ways that you can't explain, that you know there wasn't a safety pin on the table 10 minutes ago, but there is now. And when my dad connects in with me, it's quite funny. He started manifesting £20 notes, which I thought was brilliant. So,
useful,
and
yeah.
I actually, because my former life, I was a dressmaker and I was cutting fabric, you know, after my dad had died. And I looked away and there was a £20 note on my table that hadn't been there. And things like that used to happen. And the story behind that is my dad, you know, when he died, he lived in Raynes Park. And from where I live near Epping Forest, it's a 2-hour drive at least. It's a 2 to 3 hour drive. And when I used to go and visit him, nobody else knew this, but he used to shove a £20 note in my hand for the journey home. So he'd say, towards your petrol, Gail. So I like to think that he's still sending me petrol money. So you can make of it what you like, you can rationalize it, whatever, but in my heart, you know, I like to believe it's him, you know, whether it is or not. In my heart, I like to believe that.
Perhaps in my heart is the crucial part of that, really, because you could have, rather like you were saying, with the difference in logic and intuition, you can have a heart-centered response or a head-centered response to all these sort of things, which is the difference between you and Darren Brown, I suppose, or, you know, something like that.
Yeah. I have a friend, well, I had a friend who unfortunately came to an early passing into the afterlife. And I met him through the Pagan Federation. So we were both pagans. And he was very interested in, he was part of the magic circle. So he learned magic tricks. So he learned the art of illusion. And one of the things he liked to do was debunk psychics. You know, he set up, and mediums in particular, because there are a lot of fraudulent mediums. The same as there's dodgy builders. You know, you've got to be careful who you give your money to. And his wife tells me that there were times that he was trying to debunk things, and there was several times he just could not explain it. It was completely unexplained. And I kind of like that. I kind of like that the spirit world got the better of him.
Yeah, yeah. There is I absolutely don't want to play devil's advocate here, but you could also say that in the context of magic tricks, there are Penn and Teller can do stuff other magicians can't explain as well.
Yeah,
So
definitely. Yeah, exactly. It's open to debate, and that's a good thing.
let's get on to fraudulent people. Because this, more than anything, I would imagine, does your reputation damage as
totally.
Where are those people coming from? I mean, I presume you've met them, or been aware of
I've
them.
been quite lucky in that the people I've met have, on the whole, been absolutely genuine. And I think sometimes it's coming from a genuine want and need to help people. But sometimes, I mean, I've come across people whose ability stinks, you know that.
Oh, well, I've heard it said.
Sometimes ability stinks. And look, none of us can be 100% of the time. We all have off days. So even myself, I don't like to go shouting and saying I'm this, I'm that, because you're only as good as your next reading, and you can have an off day and you can get it all wrong. And that happens, and that, in fact, that's more real than kind of claiming that you get it right every single time. And sometimes people come from a place of ego, they come from a place of arrogance. And I'm a Leo, we're incredibly arrogant. It's terrible. I've learned as I got older not to be quite so arrogant, but it's a work in progress. I'm not perfect.
Aren't we all? Yeah.
But I think money is a motivator in a lot of things. You can make good money from being a psychic. And you get people, we've all had of people who try to charge thousands of pounds for some dubious spell or something, or claim to be able to do this, that, and the other. There's con men and women in all walks of life, and unfortunately, we're not a regulated body. And I think people have tried to set up ways of regulating the profession, because it is a profession. And as I say, we've got various schools. We've got School of Psychic Studies, we've got the Arthur Findlay College, and we've got the Spiritual Association of Great Britain. And I think if people have trained there, you kind of know that they've been vetted. And the thing is to know that someone's vetted. The phone lines where people pay per minute on the phone, they're quite expensive, the phone lines. But every psychic that works on a phone line has been vetted, or they should have been. And usually they will have had to do a test reading. The calls are listened into by an external body. They're regulated by Ofcom. And under Ofcom regulations, there's certain things you're not allowed to talk about. So there's things that I can get away with in a face-to-face reading, a private reading. And it's always a bit sort of under the counter, can you tell me if I'm going to have any children? Well, I'm really not meant to tell you that, but let's just pull a card on it. Shh, don't tell anyone. So we can speculate and stuff, but on the phones, we have to protect the vulnerable. And that's where this fraudulent thing comes in, is if you are of a mind to exploit and manipulate people, then that's your way in. You can claim you're the big I am.
So if I wanted to go and see a psychic and I
Yes.
didn't know anybody or anything like that, obviously I
Yeah,
could get in touch with you. But if I
good.
couldn't or whatever, how would I go about kind of deciding how, or trying to pick
Well,
someone who's not a fraud?
the nice thing about this modern world we live in, as you know, we've got Google reviews. And I've got a review page, and as you know, if you do my website for me, I've had a couple of 1-star reviews. And when I've looked at it, I've remembered the person, and sometimes it has been that they've been a difficult person. And when I worked on the fairs, if we had somebody that we couldn't connect with, we'd send them to the next person. So I'm struggling, I can't connect with this person, can you have a go? And you'd guarantee, then there was like 5 or 7 of us on the fair, we'd send that person around to everybody and nobody could connect with them, because maybe there was something going on with them that we weren't meant to connect with them. Who knows, maybe they just weren't going to believe it or take it seriously. So you've got Google reviews, that's the first thing. But also, like anything, like if I wanted my hair cut, I could take pot luck. I see a lot of similarities between psychics and hairdressers in the way that the profession is run, in that I've gone to a lot of hairdressers and not been happy. I don't like having my hair cut, which is why it's long at the moment. But and then you'll find somebody you really like, and they just get you, and they get your hair, and they do it wonderfully, and you want to go back to that person. So the same with us, we build working relationships with clients, and they come back. If they don't like you, they'll come. But then, you know, sometimes I get people say, oh, I've seen you before. Yeah, Gail, you read for me 7 years ago. I said, well, there's a big gap, you know, and they, well, I went to other people, and I'm coming back to you because your stuff's come true, or whatever it is. Well, they like your personality, you know. Same with any business. If they like you, and sometimes people, it's not so much that they get a real revelation in their reading. I told you I'm dyslexic. It's not so much that, but they might like the tone. I get people say they like the tone of my voice, you know, and you know, I've got one of my clients out in Italy who's probably going to listen to this. So hi, and he said, well, you know, your voice is very healing. I like hearing your voice, and I've had a few people say that, so that's nice. Yeah, it is a big responsibility, a massive responsibility, reading for other people. And I can remember on the fairs many years ago, and this was, I haven't mentioned BAPS. I think BAPS are still going. It's the British Astrological and Psychic Society. And if you'd been vetted by BAPS, you were an accredited reader. So you can get accreditation for what you do. I never got accredited because there was a lot of controversy around it at the time. Now, 2 of my friends, in fact, probably 3 of my friends, my psychic friends, were what do you call it, the person who does the vetting, vets.
Oh, yeah.
The vetters. They were and they always said to me, Gail, you'd pass with flying colours. We wouldn't have a problem with you. But there was also this controversy about you have to pay to join these associations. Probably a bit like the master craftsman or whatever. You have to pay to join them. So there was this kind of thing of like, well, are you paying for your badge? You know, are you paying? So I never actually got around to it because I was really poor at the time. You know, I couldn't really afford to join. So yeah, go to somebody accredited, go to somebody that's been vetted, go look at the reviews, word of mouth, of course, same with anything. But the thing with word of mouth, and in the same with anything, you might say, Gail, I got the best haircut, you got to go so-and-so. And I could go and go, oh, I'm really disappointed. And you go in with this sense of it's going to be amazing.
Yeah.
And what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for the next.
I want to go into this what works business, and I don't want to spend the whole time talking to you about the controversial aspect or image of it, but
not my job to defend the profession.
Well, yeah, but I don't want to be attacking it as such. And I wouldn't have invited you here if that was my
No, of course not.
thing. But fortune telling,
Yeah.
the phrase you use, and that's a bit that I kind of wonder about, because obviously on an existential philosophical level, there's massive questions there, isn't there, about free will and about preordained destiny and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But also, of course, just the sort of general controversy about whether it is really possible to tell the future, and if it is, on what level you're trying to do it, whether you're dealing with vague energy shifts, or whether you're, you know, as you might sort of do with astrology perhaps, or whether you're actually able to sort of see stuff like when someone could die, or whether they're going to fall in love with someone or whatever. So what's it all about, Alfie?
It's predictions, isn't it? And mankind, for, you know, since the dawn of time, has looked for signs and omens and predictions. And I think, you know, we used to be a lot more connected to nature, so we'd look for omens and signs. You know, I remember simple things like my mum saying to me, like we'd drive through fields, and she'd say, well, roads through fields, wouldn't drive through the fields, the cows are lying down, it's going to rain. And there'd be no sign of rain. So we've looked for omens and signs because we've maybe looked at animal behavior, we've looked at plant behavior. In ancient Greece, they used to keep snakes in pots in the temples. and they knew an earthquake was coming because the snakes were so sensitive, you know, with their little tongues. If they could detect the slightest tremor, and they would run back into the pots. So when they saw the snakes going back into the pots, they knew an earthquake was coming. So we've looked for omens, you know, throughout time. And I think fortune telling is an extension of that. We've kind of, you know, well, what's the old Magpie song? One for sorrow, two for joy. You know, who doesn't do that? You know, who doesn't go, oh yeah. And then we look for it. We look for the connection.
If you see one, you certainly look for the second one,
don't you? Just exactly. It's like, come on, there must be another one here somewhere. You cross your eyes so you see double. You know, that's it. That'll count. But we've always looked for kind of luck. You know, lucky rabbit's foots or unlucky for the rabbit. You know, four-leaf clovers. I remember finding four-leaf clovers at school in my convent school, and I was just about to do my exams, so I saw that as a really good omen. I passed most of my exams. And my friends didn't know what it was because they didn't have the same background as me, you know, this weird background. So yeah, I think we've always looked for stuff. And look, things like lucky number 13 I think it's America or China, there's no 13th floor because, you know, the association with it being unlucky. So people really take this to extremes. And in fact, China, you know, the Orient, big on omens and fortune telling, and you know, there's a lot that comes from there. And if you look into every country and every culture, you know, Turkish coffee reading, for example. I recently did a Czech event last Christmas I did a Czech event, and I looked into Czech fortune telling. And they have this crystal ball that's kind of many-sided, like 32-sided or something like that. And I thought, wow, you know, and it's all got numbers on, very similar to the dice in role-playing games now. So whatever number it landed on, you'd have this little book and you'd look up your fortune. And in China, when I went to Hong Kong, actually, they had these sticks. I brought some home with me, and you shake them, and the sticks that fall out, they're all numbered. And again, you look it up. So we've always looked for something, you know, and even the superstitions, don't walk, you know, some of it's common sense, don't walk under a ladder. Well, that's common sense. so yeah, I don't know if that's answered it for you, Gerard.
I want to go a bit further into it because if I not analysis, not to depersonalize this, if someone comes to see you, I think they could be forgiven for sort of being pretty worried that you could see what's going to happen to them in the future, and that might not be good, and so on and so forth. And that's quite a sort of unnerving stroke scary.
That puts people off. You're absolutely right. And I would say if you're an anxious person, don't maybe choose your psychic wisely. I'm used to dealing with first timers. I'm used to dealing with people with a lot of anxiety. And one of the I kind of found, I mean, my main tool is tarot, which I worked with from the age of 19. And then when I got into my 20s, I realized that the tarot wasn't giving solutions to certain issues. So I started to work with crystals, and then I was able to kind of recommend crystals to counteract an issue or to enhance an issue. Maybe if they wanted more money luck or they wanted love, I started kind of being able to recommend the qualities of certain crystals. And then that extended to flower essences, and I became a herbalist, and I'm a qualified flower essence practitioner. And I've been working with flower essences for over 20 years. I've got all my certification and stuff. And if I found somebody's really anxious, it might not be that we'll talk through it and say, well, like I had someone yesterday. Okay, so this is all this week stuff coming up. I had a gentleman come yesterday. I could tell he was anxious. He said, well, really? I said, well, what is it you want to know? We looked at the cards, couldn't see any issues. He said, well, I'm worried about the future, Gail. And I said, well, let's talk about this logically, because you don't have to have your psychic head on all the time. You know, at the end of the day, you've come in human form with human wisdom. And sometimes I'll just sit and talk to people and say, what is it that's really worrying you? You know, what's your fears of the future? How can we work on that to counteract it? It might be that we work on that person's anxiety, that they're a naturally nervous person. in which case I'm not going to fuel that. You know, I'll use my common sense. And then I'll say, well, do you think this is coming from something in your past? Do you think that maybe some counseling might help you? Or so, you know, I will cross-reference people. I have a healer friends that I'm constantly sending people to. I'm like, they need some clearing, they need some healing. Or I'll send people to an astrologer I know to say, well, let's have a look in your birth chart. You know, when's the likeliest time that things might happen? When's a lucky phase for you? When's not such a favorable phase for you? So if somebody's a bit anxious, first of all, I can only speak for myself. I'll reassure them. And I ask my energies that I work with, my guides, not to bring me people who I can't help. So I set the intention, and, you know, because I used to get people who were like all over the shop. And since I set my intention, I get people who genuinely want to be helped. And in fact, I had a lady the other day who was very obstructive. And I said, look, I'm actually here to help you. I'm not here to prove myself. I'm not here to be the dancing monkey. You're here for a reason. Let's work through that. And in fact, it was the lady who wanted her dad to come through. And I said, look, if I'm not connecting with your dad, it's because my guides think that I can help you, which I could, and I did, you know. So in terms of, like, you know, something, we all hear rumors and stories. We all hear of the person who went to the fortune teller and they couldn't see anything, and then they went and they died afterwards. We all hear stories like that, and we've all watched telly and Dennis Wheatley and, you know, all this kind of stuff. And I think if you are of a nervous disposition, don't go. As simple as that, you know. But then I've had people who I've had to undo other people's damage, where they've gone to another psychic. I remember a lady she'd actually came to me for a proper palm reading, because she'd looked at her own palms on the internet, and the internet can be a dangerous place, you know. And then she'd convinced herself that something bad was going to happen to her. And bless her soul, she'd not long had a baby. And it was quite obvious she was suffering from postnatal depression. So we talked about it, you know, and that's where your gifts come in, your common sense comes in. It's like, okay, well, what's behind this? And I would say, if you're a psychic yourself and you're working, don't be frightened to switch your psychic head off sometimes and just say, let's just have a chat. What is this about? Of course, your intuition is going to kick in. It does, you know, naturally. But yeah, I will tell you a story though.
When
people would say, anything bad? Have you ever seen anything bad, Gail? There's two scenarios. So the first one, I don't know how much time we got, was a lady that I told, sometimes we can't control what we see, and we don't understand what we're seeing, and it may seem innocent enough. And I kept seeing motorbikes going up and down this lady's house, outside her front door, and this was psychically. I said, I said, do you have people riding motorbikes? So sometimes, you know, and thought nothing of it. I said, I'm just seeing people on motorbikes, and then I'm seeing headlights coming into your living room. And I said, I just got a feeling you should get some security cameras. And that's all I said, you know. And then she rang me a couple of months later and said, you were right, there was a spate of these motorbikes going up and down the road, and there was linked to some trouble. And then a car came crashing through her living room. So that was the headlight that I saw coming into her living room. So there was that. So although I'm not going to sit there going, oh, it's all going to, you know, this is going to happen. We get instances to just tell someone, maybe you might want to take some precautionary measures, because why tell someone something if they can't do anything about it? And the other thing that happened, when my son was quite small, I was reading, I had the house painted. There was a guy come over, he was an English guy, come over from Australia, And he was looking for work, and I said, well, I could do with the house painted. So he came and painted my house for a reasonable fee. And then I didn't say, I tend not these days, I don't tell people what I do, because you know, you get 100 questions and read me, you know, like here's my palm, you know. No, I don't always want that. You know, I love going out to punk gigs where I just get left alone and I'm treated like everybody else. I don't get treated like the performing monkey, thankfully. Anyway, so he said to me, I hear that you read tarot. I said, yeah. I said, how did you know? And somebody had told him. And he said, would I read for him? And I said, yeah. He said, I'll pay you. And I said, look, I'll tell you what. I said, I'll do it for free, because then you'll do me a really good job on the house. So, you know, I thought, you know, I didn't really want to take his money. He was here to earn money. And the cards that kept coming up for him. Now in tarot, you've got a hanged man, you've got a death, and you've got a devil. You know, you've got some quite dark cards. And they don't always mean that. Usually when the death card comes up, we all go fluffy and we go, it means change, things are happening. I've very rarely had it that it means death. And of course, you know, I'm not going to tell someone that. So I'm looking at the cards, and it kept coming up, the hanged man and the death card, over and over and over again. And then I just said to him, you're not going back to Australia? And he said, I am. I said, you're not. And I described where he lived, and he took that. So I can see this flat building near the sea. I mean, Australia's a big place. Doesn't mean you're going to live by the sea because you live in Australia. So he confirmed it all. And I said, well, look, you're not going back. He said, I am. I've got the tickets. And I said, well, look, I said, I'm not going to argue with you, but things change. Then I never heard from him again. But the lady that put me on to him about a month later said, did you hear from him? I said, no. And she said, and I got shivers with this, he went home. He didn't go back to Australia. His wife and him had been having some upheavals. And I remember in the reading, I said, it's very important that you know that your wife loves you. And he said to me, oh, really? Because we've been having some trouble. I said, no, she does love you. They had come over to England because her dad had died, and they'd come over for the funeral. And a while later, he came home, and bless her soul, she had hung herself, you know. And that was this warning. I kept getting the hangman over and over again. Now, it doesn't normally mean that, you know. If you go for a tarot reading and you get the hangman and death, it does not mean you're going to go and hang yourself or anyone else is. Not normally. And so apparently he was the one that found her, and he didn't go, as far as I'm aware, he never went back to Australia. So that's the only time I can think of anything where it's like, oh, you know, it was kind of on the slightly darker side.
Do you have a sort of internal code about this sort of stuff? About, well, two questions actually, really. Firstly, to what level do you think you can see bad stuff in the future for someone? And secondly, like, you know, specifically death, I suppose.
Yeah.
And secondly, do you have a code about kind of, well, not trying to frighten people?
Code of ethics. Well, that's exactly it. It is about ethics. It's about moral responsibility. And you'll find it'll vary. Look, people cross boundaries in life, where, you know, counselors and things. You know, I've had a counselor. I went for relationship advice years ago, who was fascinated that I was pagan and wanted to find out all about what witches do, you know. So she wrapped up the sessions really quickly, when actually I didn't get the service that I wanted, so that she could befriend me and find out what witches do. And that was a bit, you know, that was crossing boundaries. So even though people can have ethics and morals and all the rest in place, be aware that it's people are people at the end of the day. As I said earlier, I set my intention that I don't have to give bad news to people. I very rarely pick up on it, because I ask that I don't enjoy telling people negative stuff. The General Code of Conduct is under the Fraudulent Mediums Act, is that you cannot tell somebody about their health. So that would be telling somebody they're going to die. So it's unethical. It's unethical to say, I think you've got cancer. But if somebody's incredibly psychic and they're picking up that something's not right, it's a grey area, because I work with flower cards. So as a qualified herbalist and flower essence practitioner, I can then go more into health. And I always say to people, I'm putting my psychic head to one side, because under this act, I can't read your health, but I will now move on to the flower cards, and I'll say the flowers are, and again, it's a very grey area, because even herbalism is being debunked, I suppose. You know, it's even though it's been around since plants have been around longer than us. It's a really hard one, because we can kind of suggest what they're traditionally for, and then it's up to the person to act on that. But we can't be seen to influence people. Again, it's about protecting the vulnerable. So I got feedback from an email reading I'd done somebody, and I'd worked with the flower cards, and a flower that is to do with hormones had come up. And I just said, well, look, this flower represents the hormones. It usually comes up if things are a little bit out of balance. So maybe you might like to just keep an eye on that. And then she reported back that, yeah, sure enough, she had gone, and because things weren't quite right, she'd put it down to something else. And then when she came back, sure enough, that was what the issue was. It was a hormonal imbalance, and it was all sorted out. And she said if I hadn't have flagged it up in the reading, she would have just dismissed it as the other issue. So yeah, it's a funny area. Personally, I don't want to be responsible for telling, you know, I'm not a GP. I've not got that sense of, I've not got the evidence. And I think that's the thing as well, that a reading, some readers take themselves too seriously. And if you've ever had a reading from me, you know, I'll giggle through most of it. I'll start laughing, because I've got a guide that just makes me laugh as well. So that's quite fun. But I always say to people, I can speculate on something, and I can say that this is probable. So people might say, is he definitely coming back? Is it definitely going to happen? When's it going to happen? And I'll say, I can't prove that. I can speculate that this, you know, I can speculate that the strawberries might grow in June, but they might not. We might have an early summer, they might come earlier, or it might be a frost and they come later. So it's really difficult in day-to-day life to give a definite on anything. And in fact, on the phone lines, under the Ofcom regulations, you're not allowed to give definites. So it sounds sometimes like we're being a bit fluffy, but we have to take responsibility. One of the things I don't like being asked is if their partner is having an affair. I don't like being asked that. And
can of worms or what? Yeah,
isn't it? So I can't prove it, and I always say to people, and it leads to a bit of disappointment, where people probably think, oh, I've paid this money and they're not giving me what I want. But you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. Because if I thought somebody was and it turned out they wasn't, that's causing problems in that relationship. And if they actually were and I thought they were, I can't prove that. And then people who sometimes had a real bee in their bonnet about it, I've said, that the only way you can know for sure, because it's almost like they want to take the reading as evidence, and you can't do that, you know, because it's speculation. So I always say to people that the only way you're going to know for sure is to hear it out of their own mouths, or to hire a private detective.
well, that was
and then when I say that, they're like, oh no, and I'm like, yeah, but that's what you're asking me to do. You're asking me to spy on somebody. You know. And there's a lot of readers that don't do third-party readings. They won't pick up on other people. They will only pick up on the person in front of them, because they see it as spying. Yeah,
that's really interesting. We could go on forever,
yeah, I know.
but
Sorry.
maybe we should do a part 2 at some point, which I do sometimes with people. I want to finish off with one question, and I don't apologize, incidentally, it's been fascinating. One question: are we all psychic? Do we all have psychic ability, and it's like a skill that you can develop? or not?
Yes, we are all psychic.
Oh,
If you
quick.
think if you think that we're mammals, aren't we? We like to think we're one above the animals. We're not. So we have this natural sixth sense that animals have. We call it animal instinct, and we're all born with it. And if you've lived a comfortable life, let's think of dogs, for example. Okay, if you've had, you're a pampered pooch, you're well fed, you're comfortable, nothing's ever disturbed you, you're fine. The burglar comes through the window, you just think, oh, it's all fine, I'm all right. You're not going to make a big song and dance about it. If you've had to live by your wits, saying you're a dog that's kind of been kicked about a bit or abused a bit, you're then listening out for danger. You're extending your aura, your vision of your line of vision. You're extending that. You're extending your hearing, which is what we do on a psychic level. We extend our clairaudience, our clairvoyance. We extend our clairsentience and feeling things. Now, I said I didn't want to go too much into my past, but I think by being a survivor, that I've had to do that I've had to live on my wits. So I think I've extended like a dog that's kind of been in an abused situation. You're living on your wits. You're kind of a bit highly strung. I was very highly strung when I was younger, very touchy, very kind of sensitive. So as soon as the burglar comes up the gravel drive, doesn't even got to the window, you're aware it's there, because you're checking the peripherals. So some people, I think, if you've had to live by your wits, you're more sensitive, you're more reactionary, you're looking out for stuff. But as I say, if you've been very comfortable and you've never experienced any sense of danger in your life, all of those aerials and all of those sensors are kind of retracted. That's the best way I can probably explain it.
Yeah, like muscles you don't use, and
Yeah,
until
definitely.
personal trainer takes you to the gym, and then you
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
ache all over. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, that's really cool way of looking at it, which I'd never really heard explained like that before. So thank you. We've got through all of this without mentioning punk rock, pretty much, haven't we? Which is pretty
Yeah.
astonishing, really.
Well,
But perhaps an achievement. Yeah. Okay, great. I'm gonna leave it there.
thank
Unless
you
there's
so
anything you
much,
wanted to add.
Gerard. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope I haven't been too boring.
No, I've been spellbound, you might say.
Ah,
Boom, boom. And
excellent. Nice one.
yeah, so yeah, let's do it again sometime, and we can sort of cover more stuff. But that was really
Right.
fascinating. So just remains for me to say
Mhm.
before I click the recording off, and then say thank you properly in a way. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Gail Thibert, professional psychic. And if
Yeah.
people want to go to your websites, they can
Well,
go to
That's the thing is I have a different name for my psychic work.
yes.
So to separate it. So I'm actually Gail Hart, Hart, GailHart. So my website is www.gailhart.co.uk.
Brilliant. And any corporate bods that may or may not be listening, Crystal Ball Events.
Yeah, that's my party and events agency.
Fantastic. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. And like I say,
Yeah.
I'll keep talking to you after. I'm just going to stop the recording now, but thank you.